now we have to move on to our next panel, and I'd like to introduce Tai, who has very kindly agreed to chair panel number 2. And panel number 2 is Crossing Boundaries within the Queer Chinese Diaspora. Tai is a designer, lecturer, and creative practice researcher at RMIT University. With extensive industry experience, Sang is a PhD candidate in the School of Fashion and Textiles, writing on the use of the T-shirt to embody and express the diasporic queer Asian experience in Australia. His interests include masculinity, intersectionality, and inclusive fashion design practices for social change. Thank you very much, Tai.
Thanks, Nick. Thanks for the introduction. Hi, everyone, and welcome to panel 2 of Queer Chinese Voices Forum. This panel is titled, as Nick indicated, Crossing Boundaries Within the Queer Chinese Diaspora. As Nick mentioned, my name is Sang. My pronouns are he, him. I'm a lecturer at RMIT University School of Fashion and Textiles, teaching into the Bachelor of Fashion Design program, leading pedagogy in diversity inclusion. I'm a late inclusion to chairing this panel, so bear with me, and also excuse my terrible pronunciations in my English and my Australian accent. I'd like to begin firstly by acknowledging that I'm currently on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Eastern Kulin Nations and would like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, as well as also extending that acknowledgement to the traditional owners whose lands you might be on today. We're going to have each panelist present, followed by, hopefully, if we have some time, a bit of a joint discussion at the end. So I'm going to invite Dr. Alison Quah to speak first. Dr. Alison Quah is the Researcher and Development Manager of ANTRA, Australia and New Zealand Tongzhi Rainbow Alliance, and endeavours to promote the rights and voices of Chinese LGBTIQ+ people in her current and future research. Dr. Quah will be sharing their work in the ANTRA Tongzhi Peer Support Program that supports Chinese-speaking LGBTIQ+ individuals in Australia and New Zealand. Thanks, Alison.
All right, so hi everyone. I am Alison and I'm ANTRA's Research and Development Manager. I'm very honored to be here and on behalf of ANTRA to present one of our key projects, Tongxi Peer Support Program. So throughout the presentation, I will give an introduction of how we support Chinese-speaking LGBTQ+ individuals in Australia and New Zealand. So before I start, so I would like to give a brief introduction of who is ANTRA. ANTRA is probably the only registered community-based non-for-profit organization in Australia, and we aim to support and empower Chinese-speaking LGBTQ+ people in Australia and New Zealand. We now have over 3,000 members and followers throughout WeChat, Line, WhatsApp, Telegram, Red, and Instagram. So what is Tongzhi? So Tongzhi originally means comrades, but now it has been one of several Chinese terms that refers to individuals who are attracted to the same sex. However, by reading it literally, it means same-minded people. So ANTRA is like a community. We bring same-minded people together. It is a place not only for queer people. We also welcome straight allies to join us and support queer community. So what is queer peer support? So I know researchers have consistently found out that LGBTQ+ individuals are more vulnerable to mental health issues than their heterosexual counterparts. But it is very important to say that we are not just the victims. In Australia, there are many local queer organizations and universities providing one-to-one LGBTQ+ peer support service, which refers to one queer person who experienced and recovered from mental health problems supporting another. Peer support service varies from professional psychological therapies and counseling services, because it tends to be more informal and focus on mutual connection and empathy based on shared experiences rather than formal technical knowledge. Despite of that, such service still plays an important role in LGBTQ+ communities and has been recognized as beneficial and positive to those experiencing mental health problems. But why we need a Chinese-speaking queer peer support program? It is because all of these local services are operated in English. For queer Chinese individuals in Australia, we could be more vulnerable to local counterparts. Despite that we live in a country that sounds more progressive on queer issues, queer Chinese individuals still encounter gender and sexuality-related issues that are influenced by our cultural background. This can be attributed to the complex interplay between our sexual orientation and our culture and familiar expectations. Furthermore, culture factors such as language barriers, limited representation of queer Chinese individuals in mainstream media, and the lack of understanding about non-heterosexual orientations and gender identities within the Chinese communities in Australia can also contribute to the marginalization of queer Chinese individuals. This feeling of isolation and marginalization could be reinforced due to racial discrimination and a lack of access to community support, especially for those who live in regional areas. Moreover, for queer Chinese people, especially those who just arrived in Australia, such as international students, new migrants, or backpackers, they are not very fluent in English. So when they encounter any issues, they might feel more comfortable to discuss their emotions in their native language. This is because mother tongue could not only help them express their emotions and feelings more accurately and naturally to further avoid misjudgment from their local peers, but also boost the connection and the mutual understandings between two parties based on culture similarities. Accordingly, we need Chinese-speaking peer support program. So, what we offer. So we create Tongzhi program. This is also the first Chinese-speaking queer peer support program in the Pacific area. The entire Tongzhi program has been running purely online, either via Zoom or Google Meeting every Friday and Saturday by trained volunteers, and aims to facilitate a safe space for community members to talk about a range of issues, including gender, sexuality, coming out, family relationships, intimate relationship, mental stress, or just the feelings. So to reduce volunteers' experiences of burnout and compassion fatigue as much as possible, one of the coordinators would have pre-briefing and debriefing meetings with each volunteer before and after each session. Throughout the program, we aim to offer a safe space for participants to talk, to empower them through empathetic listening, comforting, and encouraging. We also provide information such as referral and resources pack because we are not a professional team, but we do know a group of psychological or medical experts. Some of them can even speak Chinese, even Mandarin or Cantonese, that can provide them professional interventions. We hope in the process, participants would feel increased sense of belonging, not just within community, but also within the whole Australian society. We also hope they could feel more understood throughout the empathic companionship with another supporter who comes from a same culture background. So far, Tongzhi has supported over 15 community members since its first session in September 2022. However, unfortunately, we won't be able to collect all participants' feedback. I have selected a few brief comments from several participants. They have also provided us some constructive suggestions. For instance, one participant reported that he hopes to see more parent supporters who can further support his family members. Nevertheless, not only those who sought support feels Tongzhi helpful, so does the volunteers. According to a feedback survey that ANTRA conducted with 12 volunteers in December 2022, 9 of them reported that participating in peer support program was a good or excellent experience. Many volunteers stated that they have acquired different types of knowledge through both pre-session training and the actual program, and hearing positive feedback from their peers keeps them stay motivated throughout their voluntary work. several volunteers also expresses their feelings that supporting peers is a continuous process of self-reflection and self-help. So what's next? Next, we definitely gonna generate a peer support program annual report, and we will also generate a LGBTQ plus mental health practitioner directory for our members to easily get where to seek professional help. And we also aim to create more workshops and community events to boost our members' sense of belonging and self-esteem that helps them feel more confident in expressing their identities. Here are some final thoughts. So the findings on the one hand demonstrate the importance of non-English speaking LGBTQ plus organizations and support services in Australia. On the other hand, it highlights the need to pay more attention to mental health of LGBTQ plus people of color, because their intersectional experiences may make them encounter unique challenges. Furthermore, we would like to recommend more multilingual mental health services in Australia and New Zealand. Yeah, thanks very much for your listening. And if you never heard of ANTRA before this presentation, and you found it is very helpful for you, I'll put our website in the chat box for your reference, or you can just search ANTRA in Google. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thanks, Alison. That was great. It was great to hear about the interesting work that you're doing in the program. If you have any questions for Alison, you can drop them in the chat and we'll hopefully get around to them when we move to the round of discussions. I'd like to invite our next panelists to speak, Dr. Quah Ling and Dr. Shawna Tang. Dr. Quah is Senior Lecturer and Convener, Culture Society at Western Sydney University, a fire dragon feminist, Singaporean of Chinese, Hokkien, Indonesian, Peranakan heritage. She's author of Transnational Divorce, Understanding Intimacies and Inequalities from Singapore, published by Routledge in 2020. Dr. Tang, who you met earlier in a session where she chaired, is Senior Lecturer in Gender and Cultural Studies at the University of Sydney. Working at the juncture of sexuality, gender and race, she's the author of Post-Colonial Lesbian Studies in Singapore, also published by Routledge in 2016. Dr. Quah and Dr. Tang's presentation will discuss a chapter they recently published on Southeast Asian queer migration titled Exploring Southeast Asian Queer Migration Biographies, Queer Utopia, Capacitations and Debilitations. And I'll just hand that over.
Thank you, Sang. I would like to acknowledge the First Nation people as the traditional owners of the land we are meeting today and the land we were never ceded and remain stolen. I'd like to acknowledge my privileges, complicity, and responsibilities as a queer migrant woman academic living and working in a settler colonial system that continues to perpetuate injustices and inequalities against First Nation peoples. We are really happy to be presenting this chapter that were written by both of us, just to give you the background information that Shawna and I, we migrated to Sydney in 2008 from Singapore, and we are not just academic partners, but also partners in life. So in this project, we make use of autobiographical data based on our queer migration experiences and qualitative data collected from in-depth interviews with queer migrant respondents to discuss our queer migration biographies. Now, our respondents indicated various self-identifications, including lesbian, butch, gay, bisexual, demisexual, pansexual, grey asexual, grey sexual, intersex, gender non-binary, gender queer, transgender, transmasculine, and pan-romantic, just to give you a sense of the wide variety of self-identification among our respondents. But our respondents share a common characteristic, that is that we are LGBTIQA+ migrants who have immigrated out of a Southeast Asian country. The countries that we have migrated to include Australia, the US, Canada, UK, New Zealand, and Singapore. The Southeast Asian queer migrants, including both of us, have moved west, and by that we mean a direction towards wealthier countries, which we perceive to be relatively more accepting towards our gender and sexual non-normativities than our country of origin. Our movement reflects general global patterns of queer migration to countries deemed more progressive, indexed through, for instance, the legalization of same-sex marriage. 20 out of 29 countries in Western Europe, North America, and the Oceania regions provide legal recognition of same-sex marriage. And these 20 countries, such as the US, Canada, UK, Germany, France, Australia, and New Zealand, are also economically developed countries. Thus, when queer individuals migrate to liberal, progressive, and wealthy countries in the metropole, the assumption is that they will find freedom and a happy ending. It is this straightforward, developmental, linear narrative that things will get better that our chapter wishes to interrogate based on our lived experiences as well as our respondents' lived experiences.
I'm going to, I made this joke before, I'm going to make it again. So Ling and I are life partners, and one of the reasons why our partnership works is because I do kind of boring theory parts, and then she does all the very fun and interesting research empirical parts. So I'm going to be covering some theoretical work here. Yeah, so by post-migration here, we borrow from queer theorizations of the post-colonial that designate post not as an after, but as a continuing conjunction of the then and now, past and present, here and there. Right? So queer theoretical work from the post-colonies of Southeast Asia have shown how even though countries such as Singapore and Indonesia have gained independence from British and Dutch imperialisms, colonizing forces persist, blurring the boundaries of the then and now. Right? So in post-colonial societies, dominant modernist logics persistently portray the West, and by West, again, we don't mean just skin color or geography, but dominant ideologies and practices, right? So where the West is sort of positioned as the site of sexual modernity, freedom, and futurity, while relegating others as backward and unliberated. Right. So by using that conjunction of the post, our post-migration here marks how the movement of queer people from Southeast Asia to dominant Anglo destinations is not a straightforward matter of leaving behind a sexually backward, less modern country to a free and modern Western society. Right? So global sexualities are always caught up in dynamic interplays of mutual co-constitution in both places at once, never neatly lined up in some modern versus backward or free versus repressed static binaries. Next slide, please. So Jose Muñoz's theorization of queer utopia might be conjoined to these Southeast Asian queer conceptualizations of the post-colonial to inform the post-migration worlds of the respondents in this study. So Muñoz breaks up the linear temporality of a promised future of queer inclusion and freedom by attending to past worlds of queer-making practices that incite desires for queer life-affirming practices and relations. Now, so in the same vein, the project focuses on the ways in which queer migrants shaped by their past worlds break with the here and now to insist on the potentiality or concrete possibility for another world, right? Eschewing the notion of things will get better over time, queer migrants reject the present tense of waiting for progress to come. Instead, they desire and imagine worlds that break with the present. In a way, migrants, whether heterosexual or queer identified, are queer, right? According to Muñoz's formulation, people move for a host of reasons, such as environmental crisis, war, poverty, and political, racial, religious, sexual persecution. And in so doing, they agitate against their existing conditions and are impelled towards non-normative paths in search of an alternative world for themselves, right? And in many instances for their families too, right? So in this case, migrants are queer not only because they are queer identified, but also because they so agitate against the here and now, right? They do not let the politics of the present off the hook to wait for progress and societal evolution. Instead, they are impelled towards queer utopia, where queerness is always on the horizon and never a sort of complete project. So the queer utopia that Muñoz proposes is life-affirming, but not a kind of perfect, problem-free world where there is total inclusion and equality.
So what are the present conditions of Southeast Asian queer migrants that incite their desires for queer world meetings and new experiments of living? Now, in Southeast Asian region, same-sex marriage is disallowed in 9 out of 10 ASEAN countries. Only Vietnam has lifted the ban, though discrimination against LGBTs remain persistent. In Brunei, homosexuality is punishable by death penalty based on Sharia law. Malaysia and Myanmar have retained British colonial law criminalizing sex between two men. Singapore has only just removed this law from its national penal code. Even with the removal of this colonial law, heteronormativity remains a deeply entrenched structure. State policies ranging from housing to childcare to education service privilege the model of a heterosexual dual-parent legally married couple with husband designated as the head of household. In Thailand, Indonesia, Laos, Cambodia, the Philippines, and Timor-Leste, there's also reported evidence of varying degrees of queerphobia and discrimination against gender, sex, and sexuality diverse populations, and a lack of anti-discrimination legal protections. Now, physical and systemic violence against gay men in Indonesia have been rife since the 1990s in the context of heterosexism, in which heterosexuality is taken for granted as the only natural or moral sexuality. In Timor-Leste, a 2017 report documents the psychological and physical abuse of lesbian, bisexual women, and transgender men. In 2019, another study reviewed similar accounts of violence faced by these communities in Singapore. In the Philippines, lesbian and gay men who deviate from Catholic doctrines of sex and gender are targets of discrimination and prejudice. So this is just a snapshot of the present conditions of Southeast Asian queer communities.
So it is in this present condition that we might think of the materiality of Southeast Asian queer lives as debilitated. So borrowing from Jasper Quah, the term debilitation is distinct from the term disablement because it foregrounds the slow wearing down of populations instead of the event of becoming disabled. Right? In the case of our Southeast Asian queer migrants, moving to Anglo countries, they are far from being disabled or incapacitated. Instead, their transnational mobility suggests the contrary, right? They have passed migration health checks, they hold professional jobs that qualify for long-term visa stays. They have the resources to move across countries. In other words, they are entirely able-bodied and capacitated. Right? So while our respondents are clearly not disabled in any sense of the term, we argue that in the deeply heterosexist, heteronormative and homonegative conditions of living, as accounted above, their lives have been debilitated by the slow wearing down of limited or lack of access to legal protection, recognition, and public goods such as employment, healthcare, and housing. Laurent Berland's, I'm sorry, I need to close my window because the rain's coming in. Apologies. So Laurent Berland's formulation, right, is that of slow death, right? That is a condition of being worn down by the activity of producing life, right? So under these conditions, even where there is no active persecution of queer lives, the weight of fending for oneself outside of supportive systems have curtailed queer relations and queer life-affirming practices in the here and now, right? Therefore inciting a breakaway for something different.
So we will now look at how our Southeast Asian queer migrants were capacitated and debilitated at the same time in their quest for their queer utopia. Immigration for healthcare services for some was literally life-saving. Cheng Huat's story left the deepest impression. A Singaporean Chinese cisgender gay man in his 50s, Cheng Huat moved to the US in the 1990s after having completed the compulsory military service. Being HIV positive, he explained that if I didn't leave Singapore, I would have been dead by now, seriously. In the 1990s, stigma surrounding HIV and AIDS prevented many from disclosing their medical condition and seeking treatment. Living in the US for the past decades, Cheng Huat could access free health services and medication for his HIV and mental health condition at the local community clinic. He has since given up his Singaporean citizenship after first seeking political asylum, then permanent residency, and finally US citizenship. Now, access to gender-affirming procedures was a decisive factor for Apinya, a Thai gender non-binary demisexual respondent to immigrate from Southeast Asia to Australia, where they could access trans-supportive resource centers, clinics, and mental health therapy programs a lot more easily. Several respondents, including Shawna and myself, also felt assured that we could access queer-friendly general and mental health care services more easily in our host country. Being able to receive appropriate care from medical professionals well-equipped to treat queer patients without discrimination and with an appreciation of the unique challenges queer migrants face has been, for my respondents and ourselves, one of the most significant reasons and benefits of immigration. The attainability of opportunities to treat and capacitate our unwell, chronically ill, debilitated queer bodies is a lure of queer utopia. After migrating to a relatively more queer hospitable country, the respondents of this study enjoyed relatively more space and opportunities to form their queer household and develop queer familiar care practices. Phoebe, a Singaporean Chinese cisgender woman in their 30s, identified as lesbian butch, and their lesbian partner have found a sperm donor and decided that Phoebe's partner would receive the donated sperm at a fertility clinic, and if successful, would be carrying the baby. So access to legal rights, medical facilities, and government subsidies permit the imagination of starting a queer family and raising up children in their queer household. Now, having said that, their queer parenthood aspirations involving diagnostic tests, purchase of sperms, and medical checks would not have been possible if they were not in a gainfully employed middle class and highly educated position. Now, Quah, a Malaysian Chinese cisgender gay man in their late 20s, also had plans to start a family with their New Zealander Thai gay man partner. And his life goal to be a parent was fully supported by their partner and their partner's Thai-Chinese heteronormative family. So what's important to note here is that queer parent hopefuls like Phoebe and Quah unknowingly and inevitably implicate themselves in the cultural, political, and economic reproduction of heteronormativity. Though through investing money and resources in the family reproduction industry, they take advantage of the infrastructures already set up and well-oiled to reproduce middle-class heteronormative families. They become unavoidably involved in sophisticated reproductive systems of heteronormativity involving parties not limited to global fertility enterprises, transnational surrogacy businesses, national population policies and welfare structures, and as well as local caregiving networks. Now, how about the debilitation part? Ongoing pressures and efforts to capacitate towards becoming a good migrant subject and secure permanent residency or citizenship have caused several respondents tremendous anxiety and worry. Quah sank into depression and attempted suicide when his work visa came to an end and was distressed about having to return to Singapore with his HIV condition. Hong, a Vietnamese lesbian cisgender woman who worked as a mental health professional herself, also related how her own mental health has deteriorated from the stress of securing PR in the host country for herself and her newly wedded Vietnamese partner. So the ordinary task of capacitating themselves, keeping their jobs, maintaining their visa, securing better employment, rescaling for professional recognition, and meeting the qualification criteria for PR are experienced as forms of wearing down by debilitating demands in various spheres. So some of us quickly discovered that capacitation projects to feel included and supported via legal and social recognition led only to various forms and different degrees of exclusions due to fundamental conditions of transnational inequalities, white supremacy, and racism that continue to structure our lived experiences as migrants. One recent example is the racist scapegoating of Chinese and Asians as evident in escalating anti-Asian racism in many predominantly white societies such as the US, UK, Australia during the COVID-19 pandemic. In my earlier work, I provided inventory of racism. Since moving to Sydney more than a decade ago, Shawna and I have been establishing queer affirming practices in the circles in which we live and work. However, we have also been entirely worn out and debilitated in the same sphere. We had to move house because our racist neighbors lodged a false police report of domestic violence against us. We had to put up with casual, everyday racist encounters such as name-calling, condescending service, and offensive comments at various places like cafes, shops, post office, workplaces. We must also navigate race-blind institutional bureaucracy and procedures that do not take into account deep-seated, historically forged power asymmetries between our white colleagues and us. And our expertise at the workplace is evaluated on unneutral dominant white terms, resulting in the consistent devaluation of our labor. Constantly, we work doubly hard to avoid infantilization at the workplace, and often we are compelled to speak louder, speak better, and be more relatable. But one thing I refuse to change is my beautiful Singaporean accent. Beholden to employment for a good migrant life, the unrelenting pressures of doing well and being good academic subjects of the racialized universities in which we work have worn us down and affected our health and well-being. I've since been diagnosed with fibromyalgia, depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, and suicide ideation after migrating to Sydney more than a decade ago. Now, the queer migrants in the sample also have to perform different forms of transnational care work to sustain the heteronormative family they were born into and grew up with. In Southeast Asian region, it is a common familiar practice of adult children to demonstrate filial piety and reciprocity by looking after their aging parents, specifically in the form of giving them a monthly allowance once they enter the workforce. Often it's not about the amount of allowance that matter, but rather it's about demonstrating commitment to their duty of care towards their elders. Queer children, especially those who have not disclosed their gender identity and sexual orientation to their parents, often found themselves being perceived as single, unmarried, and assumed to be more readily available to provide financial and practical support as compared to their legally married heterosexual siblings. Unmarried queer children's needs for acquiring financial stability, gaining home ownership, setting up a family, and planning for retirement are often invisible and not regarded with equal significance and emphasis as compared to their heterosexual siblings and peers. So single queer migrants also continue to provide emotional support to their parents and siblings in distress and often act as the mediator to resolve conflicts among family members and even organize household affairs and errands whenever needed, especially during the pandemic. So once again, it goes to show that queer children may have left home and country to seek a queer life-affirming existence and form their own queer household, but still bear the multiple burdens of supporting and caring for their heteronormative family back in their home country.
So for our Southeast Asian migrant respondents and us, the existence of social or political life in our queer utopia depends on ongoing capacitation projects under new but similarly disabling and insecure conditions of living, this marked by race, rather than sexuality difference per se. Right? Thus, we wish to reiterate that even as queer migrants move into a new country in search of an affirmative queer life, the past and the present conjoins in overlapping mutual co-constitution of complex worlds rather than a straightforward linear move away from a backward place into a progressive liberal one. Right? So it's not a happily ever after ending, and queer utopia is always on the horizon for these Southeast Asian migrants. Thanks.
That was great. Thanks to Ling and Shawna for sharing what is obviously very interesting research, and also I think sharing them through your own lived experiences and the stories that come through that as well. We've got a bit of time, so we've got about 7 minutes before we need to start our other panel. So what I might do is just invite all our panelists, maybe turn on your microphones, Dr. Alison Goh, Quah Ling, Dr. Shawna Tang, and Dr. Meng Xia to speak. I'm going to invite anyone, if they have any questions. I'm going to just quickly check in the chat to see if I have any. But I think there's a really interesting relationship already developing between, I guess, Shawna and Ling's work and thinking how the ANTRA kind of peer support network might have helped in some of the experiences of some of these people who, you know, came overseas or, you know, migrated. Would you know, those kind of, did any of those participants talk about any like peer support or anything like that in terms of accessing queer and Asian specific support networks at all?
Yeah, the respondents talk about less formalized, less formal peer support network. So it's mainly about, you know, going to friends group, the meetups, rather than, joining a formal peer support group, as what Alison mentioned, that ANTRA provides. I think when I was interviewing my respondents, it was maybe 1 or 2 years back, there weren't many formal support groups that were accessible, but there are a lot of informal Facebook groups that people get onto it, and they arrange their own social meetup, but not in terms of formal support groups.
Yeah, I think for me, it's really interesting because obviously there is, I guess there's the capacity in terms of it being more open about your queerness, but then there are those debilitations in terms of thinking through something like racism, for example. And I was wondering, with Alison, is this something that the support network actually deals with as well, or is it mainly related to kind of those kind of sexual identities?
Well, we definitely recognize the intersectional experiences, because I always said, if we don't say we are queer, you cannot say we are queer, because it's not that obvious, but our gender, our race is so obvious, and it makes us very vulnerable to racism and sexism discourses. So we definitely focus on racism issues. Yeah.
And is the program funded in any way, Alison, or is it a purely like a volunteer kind of based kind of program?
It's been funded by 2 councils. I think one is City of Pride, and another one I forgot. It's another council.
Yes, so RIDE is in Sydney, is that right, for those in the audience? Yeah.
But our peer support program is kind of like between formal and informal ones. So as Ling said, so if informal ones, like digital support, there are a lot of Facebook groups, and you can also watch speech by gay icons. That is very informal, and definitely you can get a lot of encouragement from gay icons. That's one way. Another way is very formal, is like what I've said, is professional counseling surveys, professional psychologists. But our peer support program is kind of like in between them. So it's like here, our volunteers, they are trained by a group of professionals from social work background and also psychology background. So they are well trained. And also our volunteers is not someone you register or you want to come, then you can come. It's not like that. There is an interview for them. We need to select there is basically a selection criteria for us to select volunteers. We prefer volunteers from social work, psychology, public health background, and then they receive a very systematic training session, and then they will be volunteers for the peer support program.
And do they have a lived experience generally within like that, within being Chinese or Asian or whatever it might be as well, or is it varied?
So for their culture background?
Yeah, are they specifically identifying?
Yeah, because ANTRA is a specific community group for Chinese-speaking LGBTQ plus people in Australia. It's not for Chinese who speak English. It's we definitely narrow down our target. So we hope for volunteers. They can speak either Cantonese or Mandarin. Yeah.
Great. I think we're almost running out of time, but there's a couple of questions in the chat that are for Meng Xia, and I don't know if you'd like to answer these either through the chat or I can read them out. There's a question if I wonder if the fluidity of gender in Chinese literature has anything to do with the fluidity of sexuality in yin and yang philosophy, especially in White Snake's story, where the green snake started as male and then changed into the female when he was defeated in his challenge to the white snake. So I don't know if you have an answer to that, Meng Xia.
Thank you for the question. It's a very interesting question. I never thought about or wrote about it in my article because it's a kind of relevant to traditional Chinese philosophy. That is not my theoretical approach in this article, but I would say like in this story, it matters. It's more about gender fluidity than the fluidity of sexuality, because it doesn't really portray the female character as the bisexual. Is more like the main character is Xu Kunsan, who is kind of a transgender. So there's a gender fluidity you can find in this character. And I think she or he, the pronoun is kind of both like got a kind of freedom in this gender fluidity. So is it about yin and yang? I think we need like an expert to answer this question.
Yeah, because it's,
but I think a lot of stuff, I mean, if you want to interpret in the philosophy of yin and yang, you can always interpret it in this way. Like it's very incorporative, right? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
But according to Butler's theory, one's gender is a kind of spectrum. So yeah, you always can find the female and the male part in yourself. So I think it's a kind of, if you can approach it in this way, like yin and yang, like, yeah.
Yeah. And it's performative, obviously, so they're where the spectrum kind of lies. I think Jing had a question. Would you like to ask it, or I don't know if we need to move on already?
Sorry, yeah, it's a quick question because this is a burning question. I heard a few people mentioned, so I really would like to know. I think Ling, Shawna, and also Hongbo mentioned minority. Minorities actually doesn't refer to Chinese as a minority because there are a lot of Chinese around. So minority in the sense of heard less. So my question is, you know, people discriminate queers or homosexual people. People also discriminate Chinese. Do the discrimination come from the same group who discriminate against the Chinese, who also discriminate queer people? Or they are actually coming two separate groups?
Well, I think it's really hard to identify which group rather than to identify the systems, the structures. And these systems and structures are very complex and often intersectional. So it's very hard to say that, for example, if I walk along the street and I have people who harass or they violate me or they are abusive, I can't quite unpack and say that is this an act of racism or sexism or queerphobia? But then they all three could be together, right? So is that's why you know it is intersectional, and that's why it's important to see how we can be debilitated by all these multiple forces together and therefore form the very unique experience that I'm undergoing. So it's hard to say, you know, which group it is from, but rather it is the structural forces that have enabled this oppression and this domination to be so pronounced, right, in a specific context. And also it's very much is a shifting as a Singaporean ethnic majority Chinese in Singapore. I don't face racism as compared to my ethnic minority friends, Indian and Malay, but coming here, then suddenly my skin color or how I look become a marker of differentiation, a marker of difference. So it's always shifting, and also I pass as a straight cisgender woman, so I don't get the same kind of queerphobia as compared to Shawna, who has to then censor her movement all the time, and going to say toilets, for example, I have to go with her to make sure that she doesn't face harassment. So it shifts most of the time, but yet she also get a lot of privilege as looking queer now in Australia context. People think that she's the modern one, she is the white one. She's whitened by her queer modernity. As for me, I'm this traditional Chinese girl who don't know how to speak Chinese. So it just keeps shifting, and it's actually all these external forces and contexts that really affect us. Yeah.
Yeah, just to add on quickly, there's a bit more nuance to this, is that so the kind of policing over my queerness in Singapore was quite pronounced, but here my queerness functions as a kind of cultural capital where I'm so intelligible to white people because I look so overly queer, right? And so I find that mitigates the racism that I encounter, and compared to Ling, I once say that I encounter far less experiences of racism than she does, even though, you know, we are in Sydney all the time together.
Thank you so much. I think we might end it there. I'd just like to thank all the panelists, Dr. Alison, Dr. Quah, Ling, Dr. Shawna, Tang, and Dr. Meng Xia. I think that was a great panel, and thank you so much for your questions and for the answers as well. I thought that was really informative. I might just hand it over to Nick.
Thank you.